Donc, dans un dernier temps, je vous présente...
Now let's turn to a bar at the Folies Bergère and its iterative interpretations. Edouard Manet was ill when he made this painting. He thought he was suffering from rheumatisms inherited from his father, but in reality he had locomotor ataxia, a paralyzing condition of syphilitic origins. This illness caused his passion for taking little strolls to be snatched away from him. He knew it was the end. His left foot was amputated just a few days before he drew his last breath on the 30th of April, 1883. A few years later, only after the Commune, Paris had recovered its status as the European centre for pleasure and culture. This was largely due to those from the new stratums of social classes searching for ways to entertain themselves. People spoke of Paris, as I was saying earlier, as the new Babylon. Consequently, there was a need for spaces in which people could be entertained. And one such place was the Folies Bergère. We will now just briefly turn to the history of the Folies Bergère. It was called Folie because the word harked back to an illustrious Italian villa famous for its parties. In Paris, there was the Folies Méricourt, the Folies St. James, the Folies Richelieu, etc. And it was called Bergère because it was next to Bergère Street. At this location, a big shop selling bedding called Hercules Columns opened in 1860. 3 years later, its proximity to the great boulevards was incentive enough to organise concert cafe-type activities, such as theatre and circus acts in the shop's backyard. The Hercules Columns quickly became known as the elastic bed frame, and you can imagine why.
Alors, je me demande toujours pourquoi une telle élasticité pour un marchand de literie. Vous pouvez imaginer.
This secondary activity took off as the bedding business closed down and gave way to a large room for shows following 2 years of expensive works between 1867 and 1869. The hall was later bought by the very sensible Léon Sarry, who added a gallery and a winter garden to the horseshoe-shaped theatre hall. Here is an engraving of the Bon Marché, quite similar in fact to the Folies Bergère. On the ground floor there was no empty space, but rather one to fill with tables and chairs. On the first floor you had what we call a gallery. Like at the Bon Marché, there were walls covered in mirrors with bars, which allowed for clients of the Bon Marché and the Folies Bergère alike to quench their thirsts. Sarry invited people from around the world to perform here. Particularly notable acts were the Hanlon Lee brothers, acrobatic gymnasts that you can see on these promotional posters in the background of Manet's At the Café. But only the trapeze artist's legs appear here. The Folies Bergère had become a centre for great Parisian music, just like the vaudeville halls. As I was explaining earlier, it just so happened that brasseries increasingly required verseuses, waitresses, because they attracted clients and encouraged consumption. Sarry was also intelligent enough to dress them very elegantly, like Grande Cocotte. They wore a sort of uniform, with precious clothes, and in this regard, the place was similar to female brasseries, or brasseries à femmes. We have numerous paintings of these greatly prized and decadent Parisian places. It's not female clients, but uniformed waitresses that lounge about. One here is sat by a gentleman's side. Quite a curious position for a waitress, wouldn't you think? Another here is whispering into the customer's ear. But what is she suggesting? Another is knitting there at the back, a strange activity for an employee on a shift. There is even one cut off there on the left, drinking. It is totally incongruous. We can see a similar situation in Giovanni Boldini's painting known as Celebration at the Moulin Rouge. These women's proximity, and particularly this one, is obvious, while these two in the background appear to be weighing each other up. We can see the same theme in the ambiguous painting The Waitress. Is she turning around to look at the spectator, taking an order, or is this a gallant rendezvous?
Une passe clandestine est possible.
I couldn't resist this one, Joseph Engelhardt's Loge dans la Sauvienne Salle, which happens to be a theatre hall in Vienna. Let me remind you of what I was saying about Vienna earlier. Up to 1 in 6 or 7 doors in the city had plaques advertising skin specialists, a code for those who treated syphilis. Here you have the bourgeois at a theatre hall accompanied by
En
courtesans.
compagnie de femmes dont
Their body language is too suggestive for them to be dignified spouses.
et les postures sont inconvenantes. Quant au regard,
As to the gazes, take a look at them. One is staring directly at her cleavage, while the other satisfied man is checking her out from behind.
il lui reluque l'arrière-train et la croupe. Exactement.
Let's get back to the bar, to the Folies Bergère. Guy de Maupassant described its clientele in Bel Ami. Nothing but middle-class folk with their wives and children. Good noodle plates who come to see the show. In the boxes, men about town, some artistes, some girls, good second-raters. And behind us, the strangest mixture in Paris. As to the women, only one type, the girl who sups at the American cafe. The girl at 1 or 2 louis who look out for foreigners at 5 louis. And lets her regular customers know when she is disengaged. We have known them for the last 10 years. We see them every evening all the year round in the same places, except when they are making a hygienic soujon at the Saint-Lazare or at l'Orsine.
Cette jeune femme,
This young woman, this verseuse at the Folies Bergère, is one of them.
elle est chic.
She is at the bar and is happy to do anything. We know it, and the caricaturists did too.
Ou servir le client avec son corps.
He is at the Folies Bergère. What would Sir desire to have? I'm too afraid to say. And hey presto, he sucks on his finger, which is apparently a sign of male embarrassment. Or on the right, at the Anglo-American bar, is a tourist probably, who gazes into the employee's eyes, who has a refined hairdo.
Rageante face à cette femme à la coiffure extraordinaire.
Even publicity posters promoted the Folies Bergère hall. Here is the gallery, the horseshoe room, but the focus is on the chic couple in the foreground, the verseuse and bourgeois.
Et cette verseuse extrêmement chic qui a toute la grande cocotte. Mais non,
But no, I won't stall at this type of interpretation for a bar at the Folies Bergère, because it goes much further than Boldini or Jean Béraud. Manet's reticence to producing simple pictorial illusions is as such that we speak of a visceral incapacity for complying to intelligibility's demand. But why? Let us now examine the painting in detail. You have a woman on the floor of the walkway. Both hands are placed on the marble bar, and behind her, as I was saying, parallel to the ground of the bar, is a mirror.
au plan du bar, un miroir. Vous avez donc
In this mirror, the theatre hall is reflected. The artist deploys a vibrating touch, impressionist even, that translates the blurry atmosphere of the reflected vapours and lights. But the masterpiece taunts illusion. What interests me is what's happening here. You have this bottle of liquor. Let me assume it's cognac, which seems to be reflected. All's well until you realise that this reflection is not actually a reflection, but it is instead showing the column with a wall light that is identical to the one on the floor below. Where did the bottle's reflection go? The reflection has been shifted to the right. This depiction is therefore incoherent, especially as we are positioned frontally before the scene, and that the mirror is in parallel with the bar. Then you have this bottle, the red triangle symbolising base pale ales. Its reflection has shifted and doesn't quite correspond to the situation. We have 2 champagne bottles and their reflections here, but these reflections would situate them much closer together on the marble, as if they were almost about to fall off.
Mais ça, encore, c'est plausible. C'est décalé sur la droite, mais c'est plausible. Maintenant, si vous regardez,
Now, under her arm, you have 2 more bottles. Are they a reflection of the foreground? There aren't any bottles that would correspond to them. So that's unintelligible and unjustified from an illusionist point of view. We also have a bouquet of flowers, but again, no reflection of it. However, this time it is quite logical, because if we shift them along the same diagonal as the other objects, it should be here behind her back. As to these bottles, the champagne bottle on the far right is corked, so it is full of liquid, yet it is transparent. You can see the golden frame of the mirror through its glass. But we are not finished yet. Now observe this woman. She is in front of the bar facing forwards. If you look at her reflection, she is in fact leaning over and her back is arched.
son reflet, elle est penchée et plus arrondie.
Then her hairstyle. In its reflection, the hair is pulled back. We should thus see it on either side of her neck. But in reality, there is nothing. There is no hair here.
Premiers travaux, ça n'était peut-être pas comme ça, mais vous
You
voyez.
see the customer's reflection on the far right. He is practically face-to-face with the verseuse. So, if we are being logical, the customer should appear on the painting face-to-face with her.
On devrait le voir, ce client, parce que si on essaye de tirer les traits de
We can try to recreate the lines of perspective. We have one that comes to the level of her face, and we can draw a vertical one in the middle through the fold in her dress. These buttons, the bouquet, the drugged person, until we arrive at her mouth. At the intersection of the lines, we have our vanishing point, which must then be her mouth. Say that a well-placed spectator were to find themselves before this vanishing point, at the correct distance for the young woman's body to be life-size. Judging by the reflection of the client/waitress, the spectator's view should be hindered by the customer, who should logically find themselves between the waitress and the spectator. Critics obviously noticed this, and one stated that her back is reflected in the mirror. But, no doubt because the painter was distracted, a gentleman with whom she is chatting and whose image one sees in the glass does not exist in the picture itself. We thought we should repair this omission. In this study, Manet painted the reflection of his first waitress according to the rules of conventional illusionism. As we cannot see how the mirror is orientated, the shifting of the reflection on the right means that this three-quarter profile view of the woman is plausible. We can indeed believe that she had a customer outside of the frame who appears only in the reflection. You are going to see that the waitress's reflection was gradually shifted to the right, thanks to the Courtauld restorers who radiographed the painting. The first head is here, the second here, the third here, and the fourth here. And our military man is replaced by the moustached one a bit higher. It had to be positioned a bit higher, otherwise he would have ended up in her corset, although he probably would have been delighted by this. But, alas, he would have blocked our view. Here you have a diagram of this X-ray. You can see that the arms were crossed and were subsequently placed by her sides, or else the waitress's reflection was progressively shifted to the right. These are what we call pentimenti. They are perfectly visible. The illogical reflections aren't linked to the painter's ineptitude, but to his intention. Why? I am going to try and explain this, and in doing so I will suggest multiple reasons. The first harks back to the theme of the Dance of Death. A bar at the Folies Bergère expressed the painter's nostalgia. He knew he was dying, and through his painting he haunted, for the last time, one of the places he was most fond of in Paris, the Folies Bergère. Manet went there on multiple occasions with his friends Berthe Morisot, Mary Cassatt, and also Mary Laurent, actress, socialite, and prestigious mistress of the painter.
Avec probablement les activités secondaires qu'on attendait d'elle. Les Folies Bergère, c'était un...
The Folies Bergère was quite a luxurious place, where all could go, but only if they had sufficient wealth, as the entrance fee cost 2 francs, while the entrance to the Bataclan only cost 1.
On peut donc penser qu'il sait...
Manet therefore depicted one of the Parisian halls he most appreciated. Even during the siege of Paris between 1870 and 71, Manet and Degas had enrolled in the National Guard under the orders of the Colonel Meissonier, and the Folies Bergère served as a public hall for the Guard's political matters, an extraordinary coincidence. The Folies Bergère was thus a place he cared for a lot, but could no longer visit as his leg was too painful. So he painted the bar in his studio, which he would later be criticised for, because the lighting on the girl's face seems too artificial. The client's first model was a dandy and military painter, Louis-Henri Dupré, who had a limp. Let's not forget that Manet also had a limp. At this point, his locomotor ataxia was irreversibly worsening. We can therefore presume he identified with his model, firstly as a regular elegant customer at the Folies Bergère, but also as a man like him who had a bad leg. Dupré was later replaced by the painter Gaston Latouche. If we maintain the idea that Manet identified with the Folies Bergère's customers, and that we believe that the same moustached character is located here, he would then be a sort of reflection, a memorial trace of Manet sat in the company of his friend and mistress. We can recognise Marie-Laurent with her yellow gloves here, but this image is already only a souvenir of a long-lost past. It is disappearing. It is only a reflection, since it progressively shifts to the right. Manet, both as a man and a painter, was to exist no more. He was going to die, and he knew it. That's the first kind of interpretation of this painting, the allegory of a dying wanderer. But now I'm going to offer a couple more. The period between 1840 and 1900 is one that religious historians coin the Marian era, because there was a return of the cult of the Virgin Mary. During the 18th century, a certain Alphonse de Liguori had defended the primacy of the Virgin over Mary Magdalene, and he was canonized in 1839 by the Pope. Many people modelled their faith on Ligorism, and the Archconfraternity of the very Saint and Immaculate Heart of the Virgin was created in 1838. This was followed by the establishment of a new basilica dedicated to the Virgin, the Basilica of Notre-Dame des Victoires. You must remember the significance of the 8th of December in many Catholic countries, since it is a public holiday dedicated to the Virgin, and for good reason. On the 8th of December 1854, a papal bull decreed the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin. Mary appeared at all manner of occasions. She was spotted at the Salette at the end of the 1940s, at Lourdes-en-Pontmain. But most importantly, she appeared at Rue de Bac in 1830 to Catherine Labouré, a little novice of the Sisters of Charity. The Virgin allegedly appeared with her arms slightly raised and spread open. Does it remind you of anything? The Virgin would have said something along the lines of, "Represent me in this position." Hence this medal that is still produced to this day, the miraculous medal that spreads Marian graces. She could be found in reproductions everywhere in the position that Catherine Labouré witnessed. Statuettes in the 19th century, in The Mother of Sorrow by Jean-Hippolyte Flandrin as early as 1845, and in an innumerable number of Epinal images and postcards, which were prints on popular subjects rendered in bright, sharp colours, sold in France during the period. And yet, paradoxically, we must consider the anti-clerical press. We are referring to the terrible Léo Taxis. Here is a very Catholic Louis Verriot characterised in the position of the miraculous Virgin. Well, almost, if he didn't have all this wine on his apron and bloodied hands. He is depicted as half Christ, half murderer. Similarly, here is a Friedrich drawing in collaboration with Taxis. Marianne is depicted this time, the personification of the Republic, adopting the Marian position of having her arms spread wide, while she is simultaneously squashing the sinful Jesuit serpent. This posture thus became commonplace. So with this in mind, we might ask, did Manet not consciously inscribe his waitress's posture in the logic of Epinal, a miraculous waitress? I strongly doubt that Manet painted his miraculous medal in order to cure his undisclosed syphilis. But still, her position as the Virgin is unquestionable. We can continue to argue along this line if we turn to Piero della Francesca's The Resurrection. The structures here are very similar. You find in both the frontality of figures and a bar instead of a tomb. If you now concentrate on the gaze of Christ, it is just as vague as that of our waitress. A bar at the Folies Bergère is therefore a painting that associates two themes, clandestine prostitution and religion, from ointment on an altar to drinks on a bar. And through this, we find a very fin de siècle syndrome, the duality of Eve and the Virgin Mary, sensuality and chastity, grisette and virgin, theatre hall and church, hell and heaven. If Olympia had played with opposing divides, so too does a bar at the Folies Bergère.
En parallèle, c'est ce même clivage qui revient.
Edouard Manet enjoyed amalgamating the painted object with what it corresponded to in real life. This brings us to our third interpretation. Manet intended to sell this bunch of asparagus for 800 francs, but instead received 1,000 francs.
Le client l'avait acheté pour 600 francs et Manet reçoit 800 francs.
So, like a grocer, instead of returning the change, well, 200 francs, which is a lot of change, he said, I'll add another 300 grams. And so that is just what he did. I don't know if you recognise the link with René Magritte here. Just like when Magritte painted the pipe and said, this is not a pipe, Manet took the painted object for the real object by returning a few more grams of asparagus. He did the same for Berthe Morisot and a bunch of violets. Instead of sending her a bunch of violets and an invitation card, he sent her a painted version of them. He merged reality with painting. Well, he played with the relationship between reality and a painted object. Let's now go back to a bar. If there is a transaction and you are looking for a prostitute's trick, it is the painting you will get in return and not the woman. This is because she is not a woman, she is a painted woman. She is an object, an aesthetic object. If you are looking to consume something, all the bottles are closed. You thought you would savour a cognac, a vermouth or a grenadine, but no, you won't. The bottle is signed here and its brand is Manet. You are savouring Manet. Now for our last interpretation, which has been developed by the great critical minds of the past 40 years. I'm thinking of Michael Foucault, Christian de Duve, and Michel. The following interpretation lends itself well to postmodernist thought. Let's have another look at the painting. You have already seen the extent to which the reflections are incoherent, and so situating ourselves as spectators before the painting is extremely difficult. Usually, in an illusionistic painting, the spectator has a defined place that is dependent on the vanishing point. This vanishing point, as I said earlier on, is here, on a level with her mouth. Painters would do anything to make the spectator feel as if they were participants in the painting. And so to do so, they often painted a foreground, equivalent to the floorboards upon which one could place their feet. Or if it was a scene with water, there wouldn't be water in the foreground, but there would instead be a bank, so that the spectator would not get wet feet. Well, look here. There aren't any floorboards. The bar is cut off. You cannot see the foreground, the floorboards, which should be at the base of the bar. And if we look at the reflection, we get the impression that the marble is floating. In other words, when you're placed before the painting, you're going to think, oh my God, where am I? You would then look down and see the floor of the Courtauld Gallery in London where the work is exhibited. That is to say, there is no room for the spectator within this painting. The spectator can only be conscious of being in front of a work in a museum. Let me continue with Manet's corner of a cafe concert. When you look at this woman, she is looking to the left, which invites you to do the same. When you look around, what do you see? Your neighbour or the museum's wall? Now to the railway. This is Victorine Morin, by the way, the same model who posed 15 years earlier for Olympia. Here she has quietened down a bit, as she is shown with a calm dog and child instead of a spiky cat. The child is looking towards... well, we don't exactly know. We might even be tempted to lift the painting and see what's happening behind. As the viewer, we are frustrated since we do not have access to what she's looking at. Back to our bar and its reflections. Historians are not in unanimous agreement about exactly how Manet shifted the reflections to the right. Maybe he moved himself as he was painting, adjusting them in this direction. But considering he painted while sat down, and without a wheelchair, this could not have been a possibility. The most likely technique was that he used a pivoting mirror, and that he pulled its right side away and, accordingly, shifted the reflections to the right in equal measure. However, as spectators, we don't have access to this pivoting mirror. So what option do we have in order to establish visual coherence? If you want to make sense of these reflections, you are going to have to move before the painting and shuffle to the right. We, as spectators, are going to become conscious of our phenomenological existence. We are in a room in front of an object, and we are conscious of the museum space. The bar's spectator is conscious of their status as a visitor in a museum, placed before a painted object, the reflections of which leave no room for illusion. It's a triadic relationship between three elements. First, the painted object. that is to say the aesthetic product. Second, the museum space, that is to say the context. And third, the spectator. This triad is the basis for many contemporary art theoretical writings and was quickly coined as being postmodern. I will now conclude our analysis of Manet, as well as concluding this whole conference. First, Manet haunted the great masters as he copied and reworked their art. We saw this with his Olympia, that he was a classical master, the first in the decrepitude of his art. Second, Manet was a modern painter because through his brushwork and flatness, he would inspire modern painters of the early 20th century. But he was also a modern painter in the Baudelairean sense, who knew how to describe the life of his contemporaries, including their filth. Third, Manet worked on triadic theory, that is, the corporealized relationship between a spectator, a space, and a work.
Entre un spectateur qui a conscience de son corps, qui a conscience d'être dans un espace.
This postmodern triad, that is what we call a polysemy, when something is capable of having many multiple meanings. With Manet, there is this capacity to transport oneself in time, as it was his dying wish.
Magistral.
Here he is by Félix Tournachon, known as Nadar, in 1874. At his funeral, Edward Degas would famously say, "He was bigger than he thought he was." Manet was masterfully polysemous.